Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Sheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guests. And my goodness, no one could fit that bill better than John Kiriakou, who, uh, first of all, in terms of languages, knows Arabic, knows Greek, and a few others, was a CIA agent for quite a long time, I guess about 12. How many years was it, John?
15 years.
15 years, was one of those people out in the field. He was involved in the capture of what was alleged then to be the third most important operative in Al Qaeda. And he refused to go along with the torture program, turned down the training, and then is actually the only person connected with the torture program who served any penalty, criminal penalty, served 2 years for, they said, revealing the name of a CIA agent. It's a whole nother story. We've covered it before, but it was not even a closet agent. But the reason I wanted to talk to John this week is that he accompanied, as a journalist, President Biden on his historic trip to Saudi Arabia. And the question I really want to begin with is your whole life. You were recruited right out of graduate school by the CIA, by one of your professors,
Right.
and your whole life was built around stopping terrorism in the form of Arab extremism. And it was all triggered by the attack of 9/11, in which 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and you were involved in sort of defending the country. Now, of course, we've got our old enemy of Russia back, and here was the president going over to make nice with the crown prince and apparent heir to power in Saudi Arabia. How did it feel? How did it feel, first of all, being there as a member of the press? And what was your return like? And then tell us about this really frightening political moment and what the president accomplished or didn't accomplish.
Wow. All very good questions. It's there's a dramatic difference between going to some place like Saudi Arabia as a CIA officer undercover and going to Saudi Arabia as a journalist. Um, when you go as a CIA officer, you have an enormous invisible network of support. You have weapons if you need them. You have surveillance teams and counter surveillance teams if you need them to keep you safe. You've got armored vehicles. Uh, it's you're never alone. You're never alone when you're overseas with the CIA. You always have a team behind you, even if no one else can see that team. When you go as a journalist, that's the definition of being alone. My job was to go and cover the president's trip. I had to make all of the arrangements on my own. I had to get my press credentials on my own. I was shocked, frankly, to even get press credentials. And the only conclusion I could draw was that the person in the White House press office was so young that he or she probably didn't know what Sputnik was. And so I got my press credentials.
We should mention that you have been doing a radio program on Sputnik,
Correct.
both before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and after,
Right.
and we've discussed that. But you are on the area, not a very big station,
No.
and full disclosure, you also were writing a couple of columns for me at SharePost, so I
Yes.
was very worried. Did I send you to your death? And you wrote some pretty tough critical columns, which
I
you
did.
filed from Saudi Arabia, and you talked about the
I
crown
did.
prince as a murderer,
As a murderer,
held him responsible, right, for murder. What you were
without any doubt.
yeah, and
Without
something
any doubt.
the president didn't say anything publicly. He claims he raised it privately, but the fact is he was there to forgive the crown prince,
That's right.
and once again forgive Saudi Arabia for anything. Nobody even brings up 9/11,
No.
and yes, and so you were in this odd position, and tell us about it.
I'm glad that you brought that up too, because I decided many years ago that that I can only tell the truth, right? I'm sort of viewed as a whistleblower because of the CIA's torture program. I did that because I made a decision in 2007 to tell the truth to a journalist who asked me tough questions. And I want to be able to sleep at night. I'm proud of what I write and what I write about, and it's got to be based on truth. And so I know you and I joked before I left for Saudi Arabia about, well, maybe it was a half a joke
Oh, it
about
was a gallows humor.
yeah, gallows
I
humor.
was
That's right.
worried. I was worried about. I mean, they killed a Washington Post columnist, right?
Yeah,
Why wouldn't they kill a
chopped him
Scheer
up.
Post columnist?
Yeah, right. And so
Uh,
I was careful about my own security. I was cognizant of the possibility of being followed. And then when I'm sitting there in the hotel room with my computer, when I sat down to start writing the piece, I thought, I know I'm in Saudi Arabia. I know I'm at their mercy, but I've got to tell the truth. And just before I had arrived in Jeddah, the British newspaper The Independent had published an article saying that a Saudi intelligence source had told them that in 2014, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had broached the idea of assassinating King Abdullah so that his own father, the current king Salman, could become king sooner. Well, that's I mean, you can't get any more inflammatory than that. And so this accusation was perfectly in keeping with Mohammed bin Salman's personality. I believe him to be a sociopath, and we know what he did to the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Not just had him murdered, but had him dismembered, chopped up. There are recordings of him screaming as they're cutting his arms off, and then disposed of his body. We don't know where. We've heard reports that it's in a well somewhere in Greater Istanbul. So there's no sense in trying to sugarcoat this. President Biden, actually, before he was president, when he was running for president in the 2020 primaries, said that Mohammed bin Salman was a murderer and that the Saudi regime had no socially redeeming qualities. Those are very, very tough words. And I'll tell you, I enjoyed hearing an important person in American political life say such a thing because we're all taught that the United States and Saudi Arabia have had what's called a special relationship since the 1930s, since the Franklin Roosevelt administration and Roosevelt's trip to Saudi Arabia in 1936, where he met with Ibn Saud, the first king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz, the current king's father. And that special relationship is just simply not true. The truth is, we need each other, even if we don't like each other. We buy Saudi oil, and the Saudis buy American weaponry, and that's really the extent of the relationship. It doesn't go much beyond that. And let me add to that
oh,
too.
we keep them in power, though.
Yeah,
We
we do because we have military installations there, and we need that constant flow of oil, and they buy so much in the way of weapons and weapon systems that it keeps the American economy going. When I arrived in Saudi Arabia for the very first time in 1990, it was just after Iraq had invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. I was so excited to be there because it was my first overseas trip as a CIA officer. And I had a small apartment in the diplomatic quarter not far from the American embassy. So I would walk from my apartment to the embassy every morning. And I'd go into the back gate, which was sort of the employee gate. And there was a Saudi policeman standing guard there every day. And my very first day, I smiled at him and I said, Salamu alaikum, may peace be upon you. And the traditional response, of course, is Wa alaikum assalam, and upon you peace. So I said to him, Salamu alaikum. And he looked at me and just ignored me. And I thought, wow, that was odd and rude, but okay. So the next day, I went to work again, 8 o'clock, and I said, Salamu alaikum. And again, he ignored me. And then the third day, I said for the third time, Salamu alaikum. And he ignored me. And I said, what's your problem?
How would you say it in Arabic?
Shu mushkatak.
Yeah,
And he
what's
says,
your problem?
and he
Yeah.
says to me in English, he said, you are hired help. We paid for you to come here to protect the oil fields. We are not friends. And
Wow.
that was like a slap in my face. But I came to realize in the intervening months that that's the attitude of most Saudis. They look down on us. We don't have their kind of money. We don't all drive Lamborghinis and Ferraris and Bugattis. We don't own giant houses in Beverly Hills like they do or in Knightsbridge, London. We're hired help for them. We go over there to work in the oil companies. We run the oil companies. We sell them weapons, and that's it. We're not friends. So
Well,
I
they help us rearrange the Mid East so that we
absolutely,
keep power there.
that's right.
You know,
That's right. That they will do.
but are they shifting? What I got from your columns is that
Yeah,
actually Biden came back empty-handed.
he did.
And first of all, did he lie to us? He said he did raise the question of their murder of the Washington Post columnist, but one of the top aides said no, it was not brought up. But even if it had been brought up, it was brought up privately.
Yes.
Why are you bringing it up privately? You're perfectly willing to condemn, well, now Putin or anybody else, Xi in China or anybody,
Yes.
for all kinds of crimes. Why would you not do it publicly? Because you need the oil.
You need the oil. And I want to believe my president. I want to believe that he did bring this up in the meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. Now, the aide that denied that the president brought that up was Adel Jubeir, and Adel Jubeir is a you can't be any closer to the United States and still be a Saudi than Adel Jubeir. So Adel Jubeir right now is the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. He was a longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States. And he is a keen observer and analyst of the American political scene. So he's a believable guy. At the same time, he works for Mohammed bin Salman. So, like I say, the only people in that room at the time on the American side were the president's note taker and the national security advisor and the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So it was a classified meeting. The notes taken were classified. There was no press presence there. So it's not going to appear in the media, the minutes of what happened in this meeting. So we have to either believe the president or we believe Mohammed bin Salman. I'd like to believe the president, but I also wonder, Bob, if the president went in there and said, look, before we get to oil, there's something I need to get out of the way. We're really angry that you murdered Jamal Khashoggi. Don't do that again. You put us in a very bad position.
Yeah, but even whatever he said, if you don't say it publicly, it has no force.
It has no
And
force.
and for the articles that you wrote for Scheer Post, let me get a plug in here. You made it very clear that he came back empty-handed.
Yeah, he did.
Forget the phrase you used, that he was taken, right?
I thought he was taken. And, 2 weeks before the president went to Saudi Arabia, French President Emmanuel Macron called Mohammed bin Salman and said, look, we need oil and we need natural gas because we're screwed here in Western Europe, which is true. They're paying $8, $9, $10 a gallon for gas. And Mohammed bin Salman told Macron, and we know this because Macron briefed the media afterwards. He told Macron that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are operating at full production capacity and that they cannot increase production. Now, Mohammed bin Salman said the day after Biden left Saudi Arabia that there's a little bit of wiggle room and they might be able to increase production just a little bit, but they won't make that decision until the OPEC Plus meeting, which is a month from now. So, Joe Biden went there with hat in hand to ask the Saudis, the same Saudis he's criticized very harshly, to increase oil production. And so far, we have nothing to show for it. So I would call this visit a failure. And I think that the visit was a big risk in the first place. I mean, what were the chances of success in the first place? It's going to look like you're pandering, like you're begging. After these things that you said, you've accused the crown prince of murder, I believe properly, but then at the same time, you're going to ask him to do you a favor? Just
Well, what
very,
it
very
is
difficult.
is the reality that we talk about freedom, our respect for it, and defending it. And if you really look at the whole, just certainly since World War II, you go back earlier, uh, our allies have not lined up on the side of freedom
No,
very often,
no,
and
you're right.
the pretense. So now you were involved in let's hunt down Al Qaeda and everything. Now there's a different song is being sung to the people who are going to go have to fight in Ukraine, or the Ukrainians who are dying, that we care about freedom. And there's absolutely no evidence that has ever driven our foreign policy. There's absolutely no correspondence to it. And a perfect example, another country you know a lot about, Egypt,
Yes,
where, there was a situation where there was the Arab Spring,
right.
just as there was, in Eastern Europe, the great uh, moments. And what happened? We said this is a victory for Google and our intelligence apparatus.
Hmm.
All of that data got turned over to the military, and
Hmm.
there are thousands of people now in prison in Egypt for having dared to speak up. And we
Yes.
cared, we said about the people involved in Ukraine who spoke up, but suddenly we don't care about the ones who spoke up in Egypt. And in fact, the president going over there was an embrace of the most hardline authoritarian power in the Arab world. And by the way, he slighted the Palestinians.
Oh, yes,
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about this because you were a student of foreign policy. You were
indeed.
recruited into the CIA when you were a graduate student. You're a very smart fellow. You've been all around. What is really driving all this is the need that we have for an enemy, and we seize one that we think is as attractive as possible as a target, or what's going on?
I believe that.
You're a
Yeah,
veteran. Give us the
I believe that.
perspective of a veteran.
Yes, I do believe that. I believe that we're as a country, we're always looking for an enemy to rally against, whether it's socialism or communism or anarchism or Islamism, whatever it is, we need an enemy. And especially post 9/11, fighting those enemies, even indirectly, is what keeps our economy going. There are more millionaires now per capita in the Washington, D.C. area than anywhere else in America, including Silicon Valley. That's not an accident, right? That's because of the military industrial complex. But you've made a couple of very important points here. I'd like to comment on and to reiterate in some cases. Egypt, number one. Egypt is one of our closest allies in the world. And the fact of the matter is that it's a fascist dictatorship. That's just the way it is. And while we talk a great game about human rights and democracy and the rule of law, we don't really believe it for other countries. I say all the time too, when I give talks about human rights. When I was serving in Bahrain, which is a small country in the Persian Gulf, it's just a little island. It's connected to Saudi Arabia by a long bridge, and it's about the same size and same population as Greater Pittsburgh. So I was the human rights officer there, and as the human rights officer, part of my job was to investigate human rights abuses in the country and prepare an annual report for Congress. We do this with every country in the world with which we have diplomatic relations. And so I would occasionally go to see the Minister of Interior, who was the Prime Minister's son in law and a member of the royal family. And I would say, Your Highness, you cannot beat to death a 15-year-old boy because he participated in a pro democracy demonstration. You can't do that. I have to report this to Congress. I have to put it in the Human Rights Report. Well, what do you think happens when I leave the office and then the CIA station chief goes in and says, don't listen to the human rights guy. We want you to put a secret prison here where we can bring Al Qaeda prisoners and we can torture them, or you can torture them and then you just give us a report on what it is that they say. Well, he's not going to pay any attention to the human rights guy when the CIA station chief is telling him to do exactly the opposite. And this is something that Adel Jubeir brought up in an interview with the Saudi press after Biden left. He said Biden says that he wanted to talk about human rights. And so we said, okay, let's talk about human rights at Abu Ghraib. Let's talk about human rights at Guantanamo. And I hate to say it, Bob, but they have a point. And the point is that we're hypocrites when it comes to these issues of human rights. So again, I hope the president raised the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, an innocent man, a member of the media who had done nothing to hurt or harm anybody. At the same time, we need to look at ourselves and the way we treat people.
Time for a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. We're back with Scheer Intelligence and our guest. But we also have to look at the way we're manipulated. And we're in yet another period where anybody who disagrees in the most nuanced way with the dominant view of what's going on in the Ukraine,
Oh, yes.
or someone like you who actually is on a radio station, Sputnik, which is Russian owned,
Right.
they're made a non-person.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and you were made a non-person because you revealed the reality of torture. Only you were a premature revealer of that. We've had the Senate Intelligence Committee, not that we can read it. In this
Right.
great free society, it's still a heavily redacted intro that we got to read parts of. And we have not been able to see the whole report or any of the report
That's
on
right.
torture, And so here was the Saudi leader saying, what about what you do in Guantanamo? What about what you did in Abu Ghraib? And what is the answer? The answer is we believe when you tear people apart and destroy them physically and mentally, it's not torture if we do it.
That's right.
And that means that every war we get involved with is virtuous. I mean, we're doing it now. The Ukrainians have never done anything wrong who oppose Putin.
Right.
The ones who support a Russian presence or support the Russian language and so forth, they can't do anything right. The only civilian casualties that bother us are people who are in the area now controlled by the anti-Russian side. But if it's done in the Donbass, we don't even have reports about it.
You're
And that
absolutely
has
right.
been the norm in all of our wars. We define virtue. There is not an independent standard of virtue, which is, after all, our Constitution was an effort to establish some independent standard of virtue in governance. That has been
Absolutely.
mocked at every turn. It has
Yeah.
absolutely no significance.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's always been like this. I mean, just in our recent history, let's go back to the Vietnam War and look at what we did there. Everything from the My Lai massacre to the bombing of Laos and Cambodia and everything that came afterwards. I mean, we've never really answered for any of that. But you're absolutely right. I take a lot of heat too because I work for a Russian outlet, and
Well, that's not your choice, by the way. When's the
right.
last time MSNBC offered you a job as a consultant? I mean, you have been frozen out
Yes, I
of the
have.
media, and you are genuinely an expert. But the experts that they want on are people who look the other way when
Yeah.
torture was being done. You became a
Bob,
non-person by
I
revealing torture.
that's right. I did become a non-person. I was for let's see, 2008, 2009, and 2011, 12 for 4 years. I was a counterterrorism consultant and commentator for ABC News. And I'll tell you, the first time I
And
ever,
you had worked for John Kerry's committee, right?
after I left ABC, I went to John Kerry's
Yeah,
committee.
yeah,
I was the chief investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
yeah.
Uh, but then I was deemed to be too controversial, right? It was just too much controversy. I was the human rights guy. It was too much. And I've never been able to make a professional recovery. But then at the same time, with that said, I can sleep at night. And I'll tell you, I got into a Twitter fight with the former deputy director of the CIA for operations, a notorious torturer by the name of Jose Rodriguez. He was the head of the Counterterrorism Center, and he came up with the torture program. It was all his idea. And when I got in trouble, actually it was the night before I left for prison. The New York Times did an article about me saying that I'm headed to prison, and he tweeted at me saying, "Don't drop the soap," oldest stupid joke in the world. And I wasn't going to respond. I thought, oh, it's better just to ignore him. He's an ignoramus, and it's just not worth it. And I thought about it and I said, no, I am going to respond. And so what I said was, I'm proud of what I did. And I said, Jose, I'm on the right side of history and you are not. And now he has to live in a semi-secret location in Florida with private security and whatnot because of what he did. You know, I'm proud
Well,
of what I did. I hope he's proud of what he did
yeah,
too,
but
because
most of them
his
don't
name's
live that
really attached
way.
to it.
They have no regrets.
No,
I've interviewed a whole bunch of these people over the years, and the culture reaffirms their torture,
yes,
reaffirms their violence.
yes, indeed.
It was Martin Luther King who said, how do I preach nonviolence to young kids in a ghetto when my government is the major purveyor of violence in the world today? Well,
He's
they
right.
never have recognized that. When they do it, it's not violence.
That's right.
It's interesting. You mentioned I happened to go both South and North Vietnam and so forth. I saw the effects of American bombing and attack. And the anti personnel weapons came into their own in that war. The
Yes,
pineapple, the guava
yes,
bombs, the things that sprayed out metal pellets, wounding and
right,
killing people and so forth. Now, when they're used in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oh, it's a particularly heinous thing to do. We are the ones who made that a respectable battlefield
that's
weapon.
right. We did that.
Yes. I mean, it's stunning, though, the hypocrisy. And then there are plenty of your former colleagues who are now, recycled as experts, particularly on MSNBC and CNN. There's no accounting for their lies. I mean, look, the whole lies that got us into the Iraq War, no accounting. So I just think you're being a bit charitable, in your, frankly, in your description of them. And clearly, you'd rather be on ABC than on Sputnik, because Sputnik
Oh yeah.
is a radio station that hardly reaches anyone.
Yeah, you know
That's
what?
right.
As part of our punishment for being owned by the Russian government, the Justice Department tried to essentially to take us off the air, and there really wasn't a legal way to do it. So what they did is they approached all of the platforms that carried our show. I'm talking about iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube. Between all of those platforms, we had between 35,000 and 38,000 listeners a day. We were dropped by all of them. And so all we have left now is just the terrestrial signal and Rumble, which is a relatively new platform. We have, if we're lucky, on a good day, we'll have 500 downloads. So we've gone from 38,000 to 500. Nobody listens to our station. And that's because that's the way the Justice Department wants it.
Yeah, but they still keep the illusion of
Exactly.
diversity and freedom and so forth.
Exactly.
But,
Because
but
they can say, well, look, the Russians still have a radio station, a propaganda station in Washington. And I'll tell you another thing. The Washington Post took a real swipe at me the other day. Every Thursday, I have a segment called Criminal Injustice, where I've got another journalist, Kevin Gustala, who I like and respect very, very much, and Paul Wright, who runs an organization called the Human Rights Defense Center, and he's also the publisher of Prison Legal News and Criminal Legal News magazines. Outstanding magazines for the industry. So we have this show, 30 minutes every Thursday, and we talk about prison conditions and prison reform and sentencing reform and crooked prosecutors and judges on the take and things like that the mainstream media mostly ignore. And the Washington Post had a reporter listen to the show the other day, and she said that by highlighting these problems in the American justice system, that I am weakening our democracy. She actually said that. I'm weakening our democracy. And if I was a loyal American, I wouldn't discuss these issues on a Russian station.
This is a journalist?
Yeah, for the
Or
Washington Post.
was this an opinion piece, or this was supposed to be
No. This
a
was
reporter?
an actual reporter for the Washington Post. I'm
So,
weakening our democracy.
well, this is the argument Putin would make in Russia of anybody who, including some outstanding athletes and so forth, who've dared to criticize his
Yes.
invading
Yes.
Ukraine. You're weakening Russia.
How is
That's
it
always
different?
the argument,
Exactly.
You're weakening Germany. We have to conquer Eastern Europe. I mean, come on. But the Washington Post,
Outrageous.
does Jeff Bezos know that? I, but I do want to. I mean, I want to wrap this up, but I want to. We're making light of some things that are really, we're talking here about the possibility of a war that could end life on the planet.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking now just about the issue of the moment of climate change. We're certainly helping with that.
Right.
Nothing that brings that on faster than the wastefulness of military and the destruction of military wars and so forth. And now we need fossil fuel, and coal is coming back, and nuclear power plants.
Nuclear power.
I
Yeah.
actually visited Chernobyl a year after the
Oh.
explosion, when it was a very tight security area. And the idea that now throughout Western Europe, where you had the green movement and everything, it was so powerful that now, France is thrilled with its nuclear power plants. They're modernizing them, and they're bringing back more nuclear power and so forth. But yes, so I don't mean to minimize, obviously, in weeks like this, climate change, but the irony is that where previously, and I'm an old guy, I've been around a long time, so I can go back, I can remember World War II, frankly, as a kid and so forth. I've never been in a time, such a myopic time towards the possibility of nuclear war as now. And I don't get it. And you're a guy who studied all this stuff in graduate school and then for the CIA. And you know the enemy. You were there to fight different enemies, including the old, remnants of the old Soviet Union and so forth.
Yes.
The old Soviet Union. So, how do you see that? There's almost a giddiness. I would go further, an insanity, but giddiness in the sense of we just don't take it seriously. That the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, whether intentionally or accident. Talk about that a little bit and what remains. Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I heard something today that at first excited me, and when I heard the rest of it, depressed me. I heard today that the Russians are preparing a diplomatic offer to the Ukrainians to end the war. And it's going to be what we always thought it would be when it finally came, that the Russians would cease hostilities if they can keep what they took in Crimea and the two regions of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, are treated as independent republics under Russian control. So they want to keep what they've taken, the Donbass and the Crimea. And I heard that the Americans have told the Ukrainians absolutely not under any circumstances. So when you hear these jokes that the United States is prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian, it's actually true. We want the Ukrainians to bog the Russians down forever, even if it results in the deaths of every last Ukrainian in that country. We don't have an interest in peace.
Well, that's certainly you're an expert on the Afghan war, and that you remember Zbigniew Brzezinski
Oh,
is the
sure.
one who bragged about tricking the Russians into going into Afghanistan to
Absolutely.
give them their Vietnam, and now they have their Vietnam in Ukraine. But I'm raising an even more concerning question, not and not that the loss of life isn't concerning, but there doesn't seem to be an awareness of the power of nuclear warfighting. I mean,
I
it's
think
like
you're
we're
right.
back. I remember interviewing Ronald Reagan about the possibility of nuclear warfighting, and first President Bush before what was president, and but there's that old mentality, and what do we think? Let's say you can push them back against the wall. What we really are at a moment where people are talking about these as usable
Oh, yeah.
weapons,
Oh, yes.
smaller weapons, and we're modernizing our force. And there's the restraint. And it's interesting to have Henry Kissinger be a voice of restraint now.
How crazy.
And Kissinger, after all, he was with Nixon when Nixon went to negotiate with what was supposed to be the most brutal, fearsome
Yeah,
communist leader ever,
that's
Mao
right.
Zedong,
Yeah.
and they did it, and they did it because they thought it would enhance stability and peace. And now the idea of even negotiating with Putin seems like heresy.
Yes. Can't
You
even
know,
negotiate.
and there's no peace movement. There's not one
No,
single
that's a good
member
point.
of the U.S. Congress, liberal, progressive, not one single
No,
member who was opposed to the total rearmament of the Ukrainians and spend any whatever money you got. And no one's talking about give peace a chance.
no,
No
you're
one's
right.
talking about negotiation. And I want to end this by because we were started out talking about Saudi Arabia. It seems to me, and I'm not the first person to talk about it, that there's really a realignment of power in the world, and it's not obviously communist or democratic for that reason, or the president wouldn't be going to Saudi Arabia to get their endorsement. But there is a recognition that there are people who favor a multipolar world
Yes.
and people who believe in U.S. leadership. Because after all, for the Europeans now, that's what they've lined up behind.
Yes.
This is not the old days of Ohne uns and German social democrats and so
Hmm.
forth.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, you got some very powerful countries like China and India and Brazil maybe and others that are arguing no, this is overreach by the U.S. And I wonder what the message is from Saudi Arabia, because part of this multipolar world idea is, you have the UAE, and so they do business with these other
You
folks.
bet they do.
And in OPEC, they're actually on the same side.
They are on the same side. I've detected that same shift, especially in Saudi Arabia, and it's easy for us to sort of rely on history that, well, it's always been this one certain way. There's no reason why it should change now. On the contrary, I think it's actually already changed. Just a few weeks ago, the Chinese announced that they had made an oil deal with the Saudis. Not unusual at all. What was unusual is that the Saudis agreed to accept payment in Chinese yuan. And that is the first time that a country ever bought oil from Saudi Arabia that wasn't in dollars. This is exactly what the United States has worried would happen since the 1970s, is that the dollar would be replaced by a basket of currencies, is what we used to be worried about, and now by the Chinese currency in oil transactions. So I think the Saudis, while they may not be walking away from us, they're exploring other options. That the relationship with the US just isn't as critical as it used to be.
Well, also, right now, we have a deal between India and Russia
That's right.
to buy Russian oil that's going to use the currency of the UAE
That's right.
as the standard. That just happened in the last few days.
It's shocking, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I don't know about shocking in the sense that it's certainly a startling difference, but it does threaten the dominance of the dollar. Maybe that's where we should end it. But it seems to me that if we survive this, the plates have shifted,
Yes.
and we're not really. I don't know. Get the last word from you, but I think that's what happened on this Saudi trip. An American president went there to beg, and he came back empty-handed.
Landed. I want to add one other thing before we end, Bob. It's easy to consider Mohammed bin Salman as some sort of a cartoon character villain, like from Rocky and Bullwinkle or something. And it should be so easy. He's actually very complicated. Yes, I believe he's evil. I think that's important. But then at the same time, he's actually reforming Saudi Arabia and implementing changes that just 10 years ago people wouldn't have even dreamt of. Things like women driving, for example. Women are now allowed to enter movie theaters. Women have always been banned from movie theaters in Saudi Arabia. Women are allowed to bowl. Believe it or not, bowling is very popular in Saudi Arabia, and now women are allowed to participate. I saw at least 50% of the women that I saw on this trip were unveiled. Absolutely unheard of before Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince. You would be beaten with a cane, with a wooden cane by a member of the religious police if you've been caught without a veil the last time I was in Saudi Arabia. So things are changing.
Do you
Uh,
think that was because the Americans were there, the
no,
American president?
no, not at all. You can see there's been a societal change. This wasn't temporary and people just experimenting. This is a real change.
Well, you make a very important. I mean, I'll extend this a little bit. You make a very important point that any serious observer of international politics comes up against. It ain't simple,
No.
and we always want to have a simple view of the enemy and a simplistic view of the problem. And what was acknowledged, Nixon going to China. First of all, Nixon and Kissinger were not saints. They were killing people in the millions in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. I witnessed a lot of that. But they also could be rational. They could have an idea of
Hmm.
self interest that wasn't destructive.
Hmm.
Mao obviously was not saintly. He was capable of encouraging great destruction and fighting and tension, whether it was making a revolution or it was with the Cultural Revolution. And now we've got this again, the simple thing Putin is nothing
Hmm.
more than a menace or the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. And the whole idea of realistic diplomacy used to be you still can't have a nuclear war, and that all wars are ultimately costly to everyone, and that if you can do it through diplomacy and negotiation, and in the face of nuclear war, you better do it through diplomacy, negotiation, you got to give it a try.
Yes.
And that's what's missing now. That's why I use the word a giddiness. There's
Yes.
sort of a feeling we'll show them and we can do with it. And they're just a third rate power. Well, Russia's
Right.
shown once again they're not a third rate power when it comes to the military. They got their deadly toys they can play with, just like we do, and they're not going to be winners, and that the losers are ordinary people who get their lives
Yep.
smashed. So I'll give you the last word on this, but I just wonder, talking to people in the press, talking to some people, do they understand the seriousness of the moment?
I think they do, and I don't fully understand why the word isn't getting out there. I do want to add one more thing before we leave. Um, I remember when I was at the CIA, I had just started at the CIA, and the Gulf War, the first Gulf War was just beginning. And I remember just being shocked every time I would hear someone on the news say that Saddam Hussein was crazy. Crazy. He's not at all crazy. He may have miscalculated, but I would compare him to a mob boss, to an organized crime boss, rather than to a crazy person. There's no evidence that he's crazy, but we've said that besides Saddam being crazy, that Gaddafi was crazy, Osama bin Laden was crazy, Arafat was crazy. Everybody that we don't like is crazy. They're not crazy.
Well, even Donald Trump, right? The
Even
Democrats
Donald
don't
Trump.
even. Yeah,
Yeah, not crazy.
crazy. Yeah, or crazy as a fox.
That's right.
All right, let's leave it on that note. I want to say, John Kiriakou, I'm really proud to have you writing columns.
Thank you so much. I'm proud to be associated with you. I've had a lot of fun.
And I think the work holds up. And but we'll talk at another time. But I'm sure these issues are going to get scarier rather than saner. But okay, I want to thank Christopher Ho and Laura Kondorjerian, the producers at KCRW, put these podcasts on. Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, Natasha Kimi Zapata, who edits and writes the introduction, and the JKW Foundation in memory of a very independent, a terrific writer, Gene Stein, who helps fund some of these broadcasts. See you next week with another edition of Sheer Intelligence.